thank you so much for joining us today. This is our webinar and is our second conversation on the theme Patriarchal Violence and a War on Our Bodies. Today, we are going to focus on gender-based violence, or in particular, violence against women. So what we want to do today is to have a conversation about the underlying social, political, and economic factors which inform gendered violence or gender-based violence, and in particular, violence against women. So what we want to do is we want to have a conversation where we highlight that violence against women is a product of male abuse of power and a product of male perversion. But also at the same time, we want to have a conversation that highlights the fact that it's important to talk about systemic aspects of violence against women. So in many ways, we want to have a conversation about the relationship that exists between patriarchy, violence, and gender, and how all these forms of violence against women are in many ways a devaluation of women's lives and women's work. Thank you so much again for joining us today. I am Yvonne, and I will be facilitating the discussion today. I am the co-director of operations at the Forge. And to have this conversation, we're quite delighted and we're happy and we feel honored to be in conversation with two incredible authors, incredible scholars, writers, and activists. And they are Me Matsilo Motse. Thank you so much, Me Matsilo, for being in conversation with us. And we're also quite delighted to be in conversation with Professor Sylvia Federici. So before I start the conversation, I'm going to read the bios of our panelists today so that we get to know them a little bit and we get to know their work a little bit more. I'll start with the short bio of Me Matsilo Motse, who is an author, spiritual health coach, and the founder of Africa Ikala Fe Institute for Spirituality and Health. She is an author of several books, including Kanga and Kangaroo Court, Reflections on the Rape Trial of Jacob Zuma. She started her career as a nurse, midwife, psychology graduate, and social science researcher, and rural development facilitator. With a BA honors in psychology and a master's in creative writing, she uses a combination of contemporary and indigenous healing modalities, which draw from physiology, psychology, creative writing, African spirituality, and metaphysics. She is currently studying for her PhD in sociology. Her area of research is obstetric violence. Her keen interest is to create a birthing space which honors and integrates Indigenous midwifery. Thank you again, Me Matsilo. We really are honored to be in conversation with you today, and we look forward to your contribution.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And our second panelist is Professor Sylvia Federici, who is a longtime activist, teacher, and writer. In 1972, she was among the founders of the International Feminist Collective, the organization that launched the campaign for wages for housework in the US and abroad. She has also been active in the anti-globalization movement and the anti-death penalty movement. In the 1990s, she was a member of the radical journal Midnight Notes, and in 1991, after a period of teaching in Nigeria, she helped found the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa. which for more than 10 years documented the struggle of African students against austerity programs imposed by the IMF and the World Bank. She is Emerita Professor of Political Philosophy and International Studies at Hofstra University, Hampstead, New York. And her published work include Caliban and the Witch, Woman, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, a book that has circulated internationally and is now translated in more than 15 languages. Revolution at Point Zero, Housework, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle, Witch Hunting, Witches and Women, Re-enchanting the World, Feminism and the Politics of the Commons, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, Rethinking, Remaking, Reclaiming the Body in Contemporary Capitalism. Thank you so much, Prof. We are really happy to be in conversation with you, and we look forward to your contributions.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Prof. So I thought as a way to start the conversation, I should get your views on what gender-based violence is to you, or what gendered violence is to you. And the reason I ask this question is that often when people talk about gendered violence, gender-based violence, violence against women in its many forms, sometimes what they do is they adopt a narrative of victimization, which is premised only on issues of violence as brutality and quite the most extreme forms of how these types of violence manifest itself. And I thought it would be important to talk about, over and beyond those issues, to talk about the systemic aspects of violence against women, and more broadly, the systemic aspects of gendered violence or gender-based violence. So as a start, I'd like to then get your ideas or your understanding of what gender-based violence or gendered violence is to you. I'll start with you, Mematsilo.
Okay. Firstly, I would start by focusing on the word violence. Usually when we hear the word violence, automatically we think of physical violence. We think of, kind of physical trauma or even sexual violence. And I would say that the violence that we can see with our eyes, it's often what we limit ourselves to. But then there's all kinds of violence that women are subjected to. Most physical, because we can see them, and that's what we often refer to as domestic violence. And then there's a lot of varieties, many varieties of sexual violence against women. But then there is economic violence. If I listen to you reading Professor's bio, and I looked at your work, Professor Federici, and that at some point, like a few decades ago, you were involved in a campaign on wages for housework. The fact that women are not paid for housework, the fact that at this point in the 21st century, we still talk about women who are not equal pay for work, it's a form of violence. Right. So when we're talking about gender-based violence, it's not just domestic violence. It's not just rape. It's not just sexual harassment. It's a various forms of violence that is subjected to humans who are born female. But we must also add to say that it's not just women, because we should also, include non-conforming people with non-conforming genders, yes, so that the definition is expansive. It's more inclusive. So gender-based violence, as I explained, we tend to just limit it. Sexual violence, domestic violence, and it's more than that.
Thank you so much, Manutilo. Thank you so much. That's a very rich response. Prof, can you get your response on this as well?
Yeah, I agree completely that when we speak of violence, we really need to understand it in a much broader way. You know, for example, legislation can be a form of violence. You know, when you introduce a legislation, for example, that destroys, like the measures introduced by the IMF on many African economies, and that they are going to create, you know, starvation, they are going to create unemployment, you know, fear about the future. That's violence, you know. So economic measure is violence. So violence is a really broad. It's physical, it's psychological, but above all, it's systemic and it's organized in many, many ways. And I would say that, you know, in the case of women, particularly violence has been part of every system, if you want, in history that has exploited the women's body, and particularly, you know, women's as producers of children. But I think capitalism in this society, there are really very, very specific forms of violence. Yeah? Capitalism is a system that is violent in itself because it's built on the exploitation of human labor. And so the whole, it's affecting, you know, the majority of the world population. But on the other hand, I think it has particular consequences for women. Not in a uniform way. There's obviously a wide difference between women who have been enslaved, women who have been colonized, and so on. But throughout the history of capitalism, there are certain systemic elements, like the devaluation of women's work, the devaluation of reproduction, seeing women as the one who are mostly, you know, confined to reproductive work, and then this work is completely unrecognized, not even considered work, and the consigning of women to a social position where their job is to reproduce workers, is to please men, etc. All of this is a major source of violence. And I would say, and maybe in the conversation we'll have time to expand, that today we also see new forms of violence against women, you know, having to do with the struggles the women are making. You know, that much of the new forms of violence against women, the intensity, the surge, which is worldwide, also has to do with the fact that women are in the front line, and including women, non-conforming people, but they are being really in the front line of, for example, the struggle to defend the natural environment, you know, against mining, and to defend the waters against contamination by chemicals, etc. So women have been and demanding autonomy. So the violence today has also a response, you know, to a whole struggle that women are making across the world.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Prof. And maybe related to that, so you draw on the work of Sheila Meintjes, Anu Pillay, Meredith Tertian, who argue that what connects wartime violence and peacetime violence is the denial of women autonomy. And Mama Tsula, you make a very similar argument, and you talk specifically about the woman's body. And you argue that the woman's body has become a battlefield. Make that argument in connection to childbirth and how childbirth has been medicalized. So this idea of marketizing reproduction and this idea of capitalizing the woman's body. And so related to those two very similar arguments that you make, and I'll start with you, Mama Tsilo, what would you say your reading is of the current and the new, more public and brutal forms of violence, and or the various forms of violence of violence that we're witnessing today? So what is your reading on these different forms of violence, drawing from those two arguments?
Okay, I'll start by saying in a country like South Africa, or any unequal country, any country that is founded on inequality and injustice,
Yes.
peacetime is not necessarily peacetime. A definition of war for us is not just bloodshed and people dying physically. War for us is also extreme hunger and starvation as a result, you know. And it's interesting that COVID-19 has really revealed to us the extent of inequality in the countries that we live in. And we are quick to say they are democratic countries. They are not democratic. You know, you cannot have democracy in a country that is very unequal. And I mean, then I wanted to say that, but also, you know, in African cosmology, when you talk about peace, you cannot talk about peace if you know, kind of, I can only think about Sesotho. There's a saying, "Khotso pula nala," which means literally rain and harvest. You know, if you take an example of rain kind of, we all get rain at the same time. So in a sense, peace without collective harvest is not peace. It's a form of economic war. So in a situation like that, going to your question, in terms of the work that I'm doing, a suppression of knowledge of Indigenous midwives, as an example, is a form of violence. It's interesting that pre-1994 in this country, Indigenous midwives were practicing, but now it's almost like they have gone underground. You would have thought that, you know, a Black government would make sure that the knowledge of Indigenous peoples is preserved. But what happens is that we follow the Western model of medicalization of childbirth. South Africa is one of the countries which has got one of the highest rates of cesarean section. And when you look at it, we are not very different from the US. Actually, when it comes to childbirth, we tend to follow, you know, we tend to see the US as our leader, when in fact we should be reversing that. So an issue like cesarean section without consent, even a simple thing like episiotomy, without consent, you know, then the woman's body is a battlefield, not only in relation to rape, in relation to birthing, in relation to reproductive justice. All of those things are important, and they thrive within capitalism, as Professor has said, because privatization of healthcare obviously turns health into a business venture, and it becomes even more unaffordable, more inaccessible. So the battlefields also happens within the realm of birthing and obstetric violence. I'm only at the beginning. I'm only at the beginning of my research, and what I find shocking is how we have normalized violence. Even when you experience it, when you come out, we say, at least you have a healthy baby. What we are saying when we say, at least you have a healthy baby, we say, just disregard everything that happened to you and your body. At least you are back, you are out of hospital, at least you have a healthy baby. And what we do is we say, we normalize violence against women during childbirth.
Thank you so much, Mimatsilo. And Prof, can I get your views on this?
Yeah, I agree completely. I agree completely that you know, there is a war that is going on women's body, and the war takes many forms. But one form that it takes is certainly the war against procreation. In fact, we have a term now in the United States that is widely used, and that refers in particular to the way that Black women and the brown women, women from migrant community who don't have, resources, abundant resources to dispose of, are being practically criminalized when they decide to have a child. And all of it is done in the name of defending life. And I don't know if in South Africa people are aware that in the US, in many states, they have introduced this legislation, which is a fetus protective legislation. So what does it mean is that the fetus now is declared a legal person. The fetus is declared to have the same right as a person. Now, when you do, sometimes even the fertilized egg, and so if a case goes to court, the fetus is given a lawyer, right? And that is a way in which the fetus, the rights of the fetus are used against the right of the women. The fetus is put against the mother. For instance, now that the fetus has all these rights, now if any kind of behavior by the woman who can jeopardize the fetus, but she's drinking alcohol, even women who have been in a car accident have been arrested for reckless behavior. It's a form of manslaughter because you basically assaulted the fetus by putting yourself in a dangerous situation. In the state of Utah, some years ago, they wanted to pass a bill that penalized women who stayed with a violent man, right? Because by staying with the violent man when they were pregnant, they would put in danger the fetus. So the concern was not their life, but it was that, being with a violent man, then you're pregnant, then the fetus is in danger. I mean, this is the kind of perversion. And this is defended in the name of defending life, right? But once the fetus is born, when the fetus becomes a child, then nothing, no support, no money, no service, nothing. So it's a whole hypocrisy. It's a continuation of penalizing women who don't have resources, right, to deny them maternity. But now it cannot be done openly the way it was done in slavery, right? Or it was done later through sterilization, for instance. The women were just brutally sterilized. But it's done, under this frame, of protecting the life of the fetus, right? So this is a very clear-cut attack, and I think it's very important to see it because at least in the United States, often the struggle to control our bodies has been limited to abortion, right? Abortion is important, but it's only one part of the struggle. The other part is to make sure that we can have the children that we want and under conditions that are safe for us and for them. And the other issue is the condition, I think is very important, what Matthew said, the condition under which we give birth now. The birthplace is like a factory. You're given 2 hours in many hospitals in the US. After the waters are broken, you got 2 hours. Either you get the fetus out, the child out in 2 hours, or you have a cesarean cut because the hospital cannot lose money. They cannot, wait for you to, you have your own rhythm, So, and how do you give money? A woman describing crucified on the bed. Every hole in your body is plugged. You're there with your legs sprawled, totally humiliated, totally, as if you were out of it, and so the doctor looks like the one who is doing everything. You're nothing, totally passive. And this is really very important. It's a continuation of their war. It's a way of controlling the process of reproduction and using it and deciding who gives birth and who doesn't. Who has the right to reproduce themselves, who does not. Who must deny the abortion and who must be denied maternity. This is very important so that we don't limit our struggle over procreation to really one-sided issues.
Thank you so much for that analysis, Prof. And and maybe because we are talking about, you know, these different forms and controls over women's bodies, I want us to then have that conversation that we started with, and this relationship between capitalism and violence against women. I want us to have a further conversation on that. And maybe you can unpack further for us this relationship that exists between the surge of violence and these new forms of violence, and how they relate to new forms of capitalist accumulation.
Yeah, you are asking me to speak
Yes.
now.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, you know, all through the history, I mean, you know, in Taliban and the Witch, I showed how at the beginning in Europe and also in Latin America, at the beginning of the capitalist development, you have this phenomenon of the witch hunt. Thousands and thousands and thousands of women were burnt alive, tortured to death, accused of being witches. And who were they? You know, these were women who often had sex outside of marriage. These were women who were not self-supporting and they were begging in the community for some support. You know, these were women who were adulterers. They were married, but they were having, and also women who were healers. Many were curanderas. They were midwives, right? And so they had a kind of social power in the community because of that. And so all of these women, in different ways, right, they are cataloged as, you know, servant of the devil, as witches, and so on. And that violence has continued, you know, and again, not in a uniform way. Like think, for example, about slavery, right, where the giving birth, you know, in the slave plantation, for instance, in Nigeria, was turned into an industry. You know, enslaved women were massively raped to force them to produce children who then were sold as slaves. You had a breeding industry. So think of the perversity of this system. The perversity of this system who turned even giving birth, right, into production of new slaves. And the creation of the nuclear family, you know, where the woman is dependent on men, where the woman is doing the housework, has no money on their own. This is a situation that creates a possibility of violence, right? We looked at domestic violence and we saw the many quarrels and many abuses have to do with housework. Oh, she didn't cook, she didn't do this, she didn't do that, she didn't want to have sex. She didn't want to have sex because, you know, it took a big struggle to establish that when your husband wants to have sex, you don't have always to say yes, you know, to establish that there can be rape in the family, that when you marry, the man does not take right to your body, absolutely. Right? So all of that. But now we also see new forms of violence that are connected with the fact that, for example, many women have to migrate from their places because where they are, they don't have the means to support themselves. And the migration process is full of violence. Women in Latin America now, they're taking birth control pills when they migrate to the United States because they expect to be raped by the guards, by the police. No. We have also seen an increase in incarceration of women, 700% in the increase of women incarcerated in the US. Mostly women from the Black community, migrant community, because, and the crimes, these are all survival crimes. These are not really crimes. These are ways in which women are trying to make do because the economy is not giving them anything. And they are not ready to die and let themselves starve. And, you know, so these are all, you know, we see that with the expansion of capitalism to every part of the world and so on, also hand in hand go the increase of violence against women. Because dominating the process of reproduction, procreation, the body of women, all this work that women do, it's really very, very important, to get the machine going. There's a tremendous amount of unpaid labor the women are keeping, and that's really keeping the system going.
Thank you so much for that. Mematsilo, so in your experience as a spiritual leader and a spiritual healer, on the issue of witchcraft and the kinds of violences that healers or spiritual healers have to endure in society, what is your experience of that, or what and what is your reading of that, and do you relate it in any way to the idea of gendered violence?
Yeah, and I mean it feeds directly on what Professor has said, around the name witch. It's all about attacking women's power. Mm-hmm. But also in spiritual and religious sense, God is defined as a man. Mm-hmm. And because he's a man, he gives permission to men to dominate women. And there is no mention of societies, pre-patriarchal societies that had goddesses and priestesses. And so what we are experiencing throughout time is suppression and repression of women. Mm-hmm. And once you are defined as a witch, you are essentially defined as evil. Yeah. And leaves the men who have been given power by a male god to kill and suppress women. And therefore, if you look at it as well, in indigenous healing, there is a power that women have. Even in indigenous African spirituality, there's a power that women have. But that power of women in African spirituality is suppressed even by government, So it's repressed and it's suppressed by government. So it is definitely a form of violence against women. There was a report done a few years ago in South Africa where old women were killed, during the height of political unrest in the 70s. If you are an outspoken woman, you are an elder woman who's outspoken, all that needs to happen is for someone to point at you as a witch.
Yeah.
If you have been identified as a witch, you are gone. Yes. The mob will definitely descend on you and kill you. And that's one way of killing the voices of women. But having said that, from this conversation, I'm filled with energy and power, in a sense that we're talking about centuries of suppression of women's voices and power. But look at where we are now. Yeah. Women refuse to be suppressed. Yes. They refuse to take a step back. They face the fire all the time. Even when you have new forms of violence like human trafficking, yes, for instance, where girl children and women are trafficked, it is said to be one of the most profitable businesses, profitable ventures right now. So there are so many. If you look at cyberbullying, there's also other forms of violence that are connected to, like the internet. There's cyberbullying, and women are abused. So yes, spirituality for me starts from the time when God was declared and defined as a man. Yeah. And men decreed, almost like gave power. One thing is, because we believe in that, the African National Congress, as a ruling party of this country, is over a century old, and it has never found it proper to elect a woman as its. And it's founded on Christianity as well. And the beliefs are within that is that men they have a right and a license to dominate women.
Wow. And Memutsilo, on that issue of men and manhood and socialization, through our efforts of cultivating solutions, you argue that part of the work is working with men. And you argue that first and foremost, in that work, what is important is that men have to confront their own conditioning. And to me, that says that there's something about the way in which men are conditioned that needs confronting. And this can be in the ways that they're socialized, the kind of manhood which is linked to patriarchy, and this violent kind of socialization, or the socialization that makes it okay for manhood and patriarchy to be violent. So drawing from those things, in what ways do social norms, driven by culture, driven by religion, contribute to the devaluing perceptions of women and womanhood?
The thing is, capitalism thrives on inequality and injustice. Mm-hmm. And one of the most effective tools that kind of makes sure that inequality and injustice continues is patriarchy. Patriarchy, therefore, in a sense, has got a negative effect both on men and women. Mm-hmm. If you look at the war, we all in our governments, we have a department called Department of Defense. And if you look at it, defense or military, that department in almost all governments is the one that has the most, the biggest budget. And that's the department that licenses, that gives permission for boys and men to be trained to kill. And in a sense, then war becomes profitable. If you look at the countries that are within the Security Council of the UN, you'll find that they're the ones who actually manufacture more arms. So what is the point of manufacturing arms if you don't create war? And how do you create war if you don't manufacture soldiers? So in a sense, you have to create a condition in this country where Black boys, young men are hungry, there's no employment. And for instance, the army is the only place that you can go to. Mm-hmm. So the army is a form of livelihood. That's one way, that's one example. But the other example in terms of how patriarchy impacts on men, capitalism pays men for being away from home, for taking part in taking care of their children. It's called overtime, even though now that has been passed on to women as well. And the sad thing is, even in military, we celebrate the fact that more and more women are generals in military. We don't question, the nature of war. We see it as equality, that we have more and more women becoming generals. But in my work as a healer, I am in the process now of starting what I call searching for a healing justice framework as a response to violence against women. And what I mean by that, because if you look at, we have as a country inherited a law that is a kind of a justice system that is founded on the superiority of the European law. And retributive justice on its own is not interested in mending fractured souls. It's not interested interested in rebuilding communities. It's only interested in punishment. So in the work that I'm beginning to do now, I'm saying, is there a way that we can create what I call a Indigenous healing justice framework that makes men take responsibility for their violence, but at the same time, is there a way in which we can begin to heal and rebuild? So in the work that I've been doing with men, it's amazing that, and I've been working with ex-offenders. It is amazing that when men that I work with realize the impact of patriarchy on their psyche, it's something that is like just shocking for them. And it's something that we need to do, because the issue is not men. The issue is sexism and women's exploitation and repression. Mm-hmm. So we have to address the problem, and whether it's women or men, the root of the problem has to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So, Prof, can I also get your views on this?
Yeah, the logic of this system on the question of war, this is a system where, producing arms is a productive activity. Mm-hmm. It's an activity that presumably contributes to the wealth of the country. It's part of the GNP, whereas housework, reproduction, taking care of people's life, raising children is not seen as part of the economy, is not seen as production. This already tells you, right, what this society is about. And I agree, the men are not the issue. It's, in a way, they have to be made to understand. Some do, but the majority still not, that, the little power they derive by controlling women, by bossing women, by using the services of women, and by feeling superior to women, is actually something that they pay back enormously in terms of enslavement to capitalism. For example, there are so many examples. I mean, the example of war is really so powerful, right? That is the men who have been doing the dying. And, in this glorification of masculinity and so on, there's in fact has been a massive destruction of young men's lives. But at the same time, also in relation to work, in relation to their jobs. How many men, for example, in front of a strike, often have pulled back because they were responsible, for the well-being, for the sustenance of their wife and children. So the dependent wife, is a wife you can boss around, you can, force her to have sex, and you can feel big because she has no choice. But then it means that you also have no choice, and it's very clear to me that the feminist movement and women having more autonomy, it's a power that women have also given to men. And, there is a whole education process, because many men have a very limited, conception of from where to draw, their power. And there is a whole work that, has to be done. And I think that the more and more women have been able to build forms of solidarity, and they have been able also to build struggles that are dealing with the real condition, the material conditions of life. This is an educational process. And I agree completely. In fact, in the 70s, at the end of the 70s, when the feminist movement in the United States was fighting for allowing women to enter the army, we said, no way. We should fight. If we're talking about equality, we should talk about men's equality with us. In this particular case, equality should work the other way around. Every man out of the army. Nobody should join for wars that are all colonial wars, that are all exploitative wars. Because all the wars, if you look, to the history of capitalism, they are always for conquering territory, conquering resources, getting their hands on trees, rubber, oil, petroleum, etc., etc. That's what war is about. And the cannon fodder is our children. The cannon fodder is the men of our community, and now the women as well. And this is really scandalous. And I want to add something else, that really brings out this contradiction. Right now, over the last week in the United States, in addition to all the great protests against police brutality, against the whole history of racism in the United States, because slavery has not ended in this country. But in addition to that, there have also been demonstrations, in a protest of this young woman, 21 years old, who has been killed. She has disappeared on an army base. And, the army people have done nothing until the women in their community and other people have begun to demand justice. And so what have they found? They found that it was, a man in the army who basically abused her sexually and then killed her, And this has happened so many times over the last few years. There's a huge amount of violence that is going on. Women who are entering the army, they're entering one of the, an institution that is there precisely to carry on war. And it's dehumanizing the young men who join, teaching them that killing is something that is used, that is good, and is part of their affirmation as men. And so you go there as a woman, and because you want to be equal, you want to travel the world, and then so many have been abused. And I think those contradictions, we really need to bring them out, because we have to say women out of the army, everybody out of the army. Enough with this war. Now in the United States, one big demand has been defund the police, actually defund the system. But let's start with defund the police and use the money that is going into the police. New York, $6 billion. $6 billion just for the New York police. So defund the police, use the money, and put it in service in the community. And that has to be expanded to say defund war. No more war, no more military department. And reach out. I think that's where the women, our struggle as women, feminists, has to be. This is one centerpiece of our struggle. Move the way the wealth that we produced, that all our people have produced, from war, from destruction, from the jail, from surveillance systems, and move it and place it at the service of the communities, at the service of reproduction, education, health, the care of the environment, procreation. This is where the wealth has to be. And I think this is where, for me, this is where the feminist struggle of everybody's struggle should be.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that. And as we wrap up, we are going to talk about, how women should intensify these struggles and these various forms of resistance. But you raise something that I want to bring up to you, Mama Tilo. So Prof talks about contradictions that exist, particularly on the issue of legislative frameworks and the justice system, or how women experience the justice system. So, the issue of women being involved in struggle and forming various forms of resistance against gendered violence, has been with us throughout time, with the first tribunal on crimes against women being in 1976 already. And there already, at that tribunal, there were, women from 40 different countries around the world. So women have been involved in the struggle, and they have been cultivating various forms of struggle. But then there is this contradiction that exists, which is the culture of impunity. So what I want to ask you is, what informs this culture of impunity? So when we look at our society and we look at this contradiction, that on the one hand, we've had gendered violence throughout time, but also on the other hand, we've had, resistance and struggle. And also in between that, there are laws and legislative frameworks that have been in place, but at the same time, there's a breakdown of trust when it comes to women and law enforcers. I think of the relationship, the broken trust between police and sex workers in South Africa. And so in terms of that culture of impunity, even with the existence of all these different kinds of resistance and struggle, what causes this culture of impunity? What about our society is not going right? That we have this culture of impunity, which is violating to women in many ways. So women, won't report rape as a consequence of this. And women get discouraged when they look at the rate of reported rapes and the rate of persecution. So there's clearly a culture of impunity. And I'd like you to talk to us about, what causes this culture of impunity.
The culture of impunity for me comes in two forms. If you're specifically talking about culture of impunity against women's bodies,
yes.
You only have to go to the story of the Garden of Eden, as an example. This woman who ate the apple and the story of the snake and whatever, everybody believes that women are evil. And that our being evil started there. So somehow in people's psyche, there's a feeling that a woman's head must be crushed in the same way as a snake's head. Because a woman is as evil as a snake. So that's essentially where it comes from. But it's not just Christianity. You'll find that if you look at many religions, most religions are started by men. So they have a patriarchal foundation. And it's not just the Garden of Eden. If you go deeper into most religions, religions see women as evil and as inferior. But at the level of humanity, not just women, if you strip off people's dignity, if you strip that off and you turn them into vultures, essentially what's going to happen is that they're going to turn against one another.
Yeah.
So the system is turning us all into vultures. And the feeling should be, to survive, I must kill. And in a sense, power, our perception of power is that power is limited. For me to have power, I must take power from you. For me to have food, for me to have a job, for me to have resources, income, I must take what you have. So our humanity is reduced to bare minimum. In a sense, that's why you see that as a country, we have come to a place where a woman who's 8 months pregnant is found hanging from a tree. And you think that a country like us will come to a standstill. And there has been actually reports coming out of pregnant women being killed. When we have come to a point where we kill pregnant women, the symbolic meaning there is that we are crushing ourselves.
Yeah.
We are destroying ourselves, because when you kill a pregnant woman, you are killing life, you are destroying life. So we are at that point where we have got no essence whatsoever for what life means.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Mama Tsilia. So, as we reach the end of our conversation, I want us to talk about cultivating solutions and forms of resistance. So, I'll start with you, Prof. Federici. So in trying to cultivate solutions,
Yes.
in trying to confront and to disrupt these cultures, cultures of impunity, and these various forms of violence against women or gendered violence. Mamatsilo explained, the importance when we were beginning of not only talking about, in cultivating solutions, not only talking about violence against women, but also talking about gender non-conforming, LGBTQIA+, identifying persons. And so this says to me that we need a multi-pronged approach. And
Yes.
because this is a systematic and a systemic and a societal problem that happens worldwide, daily, it seems to me that we need to cultivate transnational forms of resistance, whether we draw from existing ones or whether we create new ones. And of course, these change with time, and this change all the time. So maybe as a way to end the conversation and as a way to talk about solutions. So in what ways then, do we cultivate these solutions, drawing from existing resistance and creating new forms of resistance? Where to from now?
Yeah, I think many things, one thing important, and this connects with something that Matthew said before when we were talking about, how do you change men's attitude? And there's been a whole discussion in the United States about the fact that they need to move away from some of the solution that earlier feminists had taken, which is to demand more jailing time, more penalization, and that's what Angela Davis called carceral feminism. The feminism that thinks the solution is to get more jail time for men that are guilty of rape, and the reason is that first of all it doesn't deal with the system, but also that those punitive measures then are always used against the same community that are already being victimized. And so that there has to be, another conception of how to deal with men who are acting in a way that is abusive, that is a social, the whole discussion about restorative justice, right? Restorative justice, which is a justice that in relation to the individual man takes the position that they have to be recuperated, or effort has to be made to be recuperated if it's possible. But then the whole issue, of course, is to change the system, to change the material condition. And that, I think, is the important things. Feminism as a movement that is both anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, as well as anti-sexist, and to see the connection, with the struggle. And I think that today there is already a lot that is happening. I know that there are international networks and national networks. Or, for example, I know a lot more now. There was a time I was in Africa. I had a lot of contact with feminist movement in Africa. Now that I've been back in the United States for many years, I have a lot more contact with women in Latin America. And I know there is broad networks that have been forming of women, indigenous, campesina women who are, agricultural workers, farmers, and also women who are in the urban centers, and how it's becoming very, very, very clear that women who are struggling around defending their land, defending the environment against the mining and so on, also have to be feminist. The feminine, because in that struggle, very often they cannot struggle against the mine, they cannot struggle against the colonial system unless they struggle first with the men in their community, with their husband, with their, fathers, who are saying, no, you cannot do this, no, you cannot do that. Or, for example, younger men, when a mining company comes to town, younger men say, hey, that's a job, that's some money, I can buy some alcohol, I can buy some sex, etc., etc. Whereas it's the women who, are looking down the line, and they're seeing that after some years of mining, the life of the community is finished. Once you have deforested an area, right? So today, women are, and there's a new feminism. Okay, I think that my answer is there's a new, broad-based, internationally connected feminist movement that sees the need to connect the struggle against patriarchy with the struggle against the destruction of the environment, against colonial relations, and the whole set of exploitation, forms of exploitation that capitalism puts into place, and sees that the issue of patriarchal power is really central to all these struggles. For instance, a classic example that so many women are confronting now in Latin America is that, in some indigenous communities, they are not allowed to participate in the assemblies where decision-making are made, because some indigenous communities are also having patriarchal relations. In many cases, the heritage of colonization. So what does it mean that you are not part of the decision making? Means that it undermines the struggle of the very people, the women, who usually are on the front line. They usually, when the people that want to deforest an area, they are there in the front line, them and the children, who are the first to fight against the contamination of a river. Look at what happened in Dakota, Standing Rock in Dakota. It was the indigenous women of the Lakota tribe. They called themselves the defenders of the water, and those women, they are the ones who also are saying, no, we need the women's rights, because often the men in their community are standing in the way. So that actually the ability of women to have autonomy and so on, it's also a defense. It's also a power for every struggle. And certainly a great power today for ecological struggle, for anti-colonial, anti-capitalist struggles.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Prof. Mematelo, can I get your response on this?
Okay, I'd like to add on to what Professor has said already. In many of the struggles, global struggles around the world, in the past few decades, what has been missing is the voices of indigenous women. But bringing in indigenous women, into the circle does not necessarily mean that indigenous cultures have not been colonized. Because a lot of these indigenous cultures and practices has a touch of colonialism to it. So when we open that up, we have to be very clear, in terms of the voices of indigenous women, but also how we have been colonized, whether through religion, culture, capitalism, But I really like the idea of our connection with nature. I see that as our power, Say, for instance, if we were to defend water, or if we were to defend forests, if we were to defend nature. But what I'm hearing and what should be coming out through clearly is the intersectional nature of the struggle currently. Audre Lorde said many years ago, there's no one single issue struggle. And we see this now more and more, that there are so many issues. But the danger that we do is we separate issues. We often do not fail to find a link between all the issues, so that you see that all the issues, if we address all of them, they point to one thing. They point to dismantling the system.
Yes.
And what is at the root of the system is this violent economy. The violent economy in which we all live. How do we even begin to address domestic violence within a violent economy? How do we even start talking about safe motherhood or safe delivery within a violent economy? So that, to me, is the essence. But I also like the idea of transatlantic coalitions, and I'm excited about this conversation today. And for me, just listening to you, Prof, it just deepens, the way that we need to dig. But digging, let's forget groups of rural women who survive every day. Let's not forget their power to survive. There's something to be harvested there. There's something to be learned there. There's a theory, perhaps, of survival that we need to learn from. And that, in a sense, I think this is where we should go. I'm very mindful of the fact that my room has gotten darker and darker, and I'm not that visible. And, so that's really my contribution for today.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of our discussion today. I'd like to thank you, Mematsilo, again, and you, Prof. Federici, today. And thank you so much for your important work and your quite rich contribution today. And we really hope to work with you again in the near future. And as I said, when we started, we're very delighted to be able to have a conversation with you about these issues. And thank you. Have a good evening. And have a good afternoon to you, Prof.
You too. And thank you to Matila, and I hope we stay in touch.
Yes. We will definitely. I'd like to stay.
At the beginning, yes.
I would definitely like to stay in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.